everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today we're going to start talking about sectionalism, which is a big fancy word for anger between the North and the South over the number one topic of the time in the 1800s, slavery. Let's get into it. You may be aware that America has a civil war. The Civil War is not super simple, but at the same time it is. The Civil War is going to be fought over slavery. Now, we're going to talk a lot about that in detail because apparently there's people that want to argue it wasn't, and we'll talk about it when we get there, talk about why it was fought over Civil War, why some people might think it wasn't, and how they're wrong. Anyway, let's talk about how we go from the era of good feelings that, up to 1925 to 35 years later in 1861, America declares war on itself. Where did it go wrong? Well, it's going to have a lot to do with slavery. A lot to do with slavery. And the tensions with slavery are really going to be ramped up in the North because the North is adamantly against slavery. This does not mean there are not racist people in the North. Absolutely there were. There is a big difference in being racist and discriminatory because the North was discriminatory against all types of immigrants, the Irish, any other people coming in here to compete for jobs. The North is racist and discriminatory. There's a big difference in being racist and discriminatory and daggone chattel slavery. All right. So you can be a wild, vicious racist and still be opposed to the institution of owning another human. Those are not mutually exclusive. There is a big fancy word that we will use a lot in this course called sectionalism. Section is a part of it. It's the North and the South. And it's the belief that your section is right and the other section is trash. If you're in the North, you think the North is right and the South is trash. If you're in the South, you think the South is right and the North is trash. And the thing that they are going to argue over is slavery in a variety of contexts. All right. So this has been building up gradually over time. Here is the best way to kind of to describe it and get started here to kind of explain sectionalism. So there's the North and the South, all right? At this point, there's a whole thing with Texas joining the United States. Texas actually was our own country for like a couple years. They actually fought a bunch of Americans to move to Texas, fought Mexico, got their independence, and realized Mexico was getting ready to come right back and take them back over again, and they jumped in and joined America. And we'll talk about that in a future lesson here. So you have the North, all right, which is no slavery, the South, which is yes slavery, and the West, which is we don't know yet. That helps lead to the tensions in slavery because the question is, in the West, is slavery going to expand out there or not? All right, so this is why the debate over slavery becomes common. All right, if it was just stationary in the South, it would have been controversial, but it wouldn't have been like the number one topic of the day. It's the fact that we have all this unorganized territory now in the West, and granted, if you're thinking, you talked about the 3630 line and said slavery couldn't spread anymore out West. We're going to get to that in a future lesson. I'm trying to simplify it as much here. So just go with me right here and I will clarify that actually in the next lesson. The argument becomes, is slavery going to expand and get bigger? That is something the North can't tolerate, something the South wants to happen. That's kind of the mentality when a book gets written. There's this woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe, pictured, all right, who is going to write a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, she had multiple kids. She had a child. So a lot of people have children. Her youngest child got sick, and she watched this child be sick, and there's nothing she could do for him. He was in agonizing pain all the time. It was just an infant baby, and the baby ends up passing away. It was a traumatic A lot of people have been through this in life, and it's an incomprehensible tragedy. In her grief, she lives in the North, all right? She realizes the grief that she feels for losing her child and watching helplessly as her child is taken from her is actually the exact same experience that slaves have in the South commonly when they have babies that are taken from them and sold to somebody else. But this isn't God or disease or anything about taking a child. This is another human taking a child from their family and they will never see him again. It's a permanent separation, like death. Harriet Beecher Stowe makes this connection between her own grief and what slaves in the South must experience when they lose a child that is taken from them. And she writes a book, a very famous book, called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin, it is a fictional book, means none of the characters in it are real people, but it could happen. And it talks about slavery in the South. There's a bunch of little mini stories that are in it, but like Uncle Tom is this really good slave, works with his owner, and his owner treats him well, and he's like, hooray. Well, his owner gets in some financial trouble and has to sell Uncle Tom to another plantation owner, and this guy's a sack of crap, and Uncle Tom goes and works for this guy, and that guy beats up on Uncle Tom all the time, and he's like, oh my gosh, I must not be a good worker. So Uncle Tom keeps trying to be a better worker to please his master, even though the master's a sack of crap and an alcoholic, and then the book ends with the master getting drunk and beating Uncle Tom to death. It's not a feel-good book, and there's a lot of other little tidbits in it. When this book comes out, it's an international bestseller, or at least countrywide bestseller. And the North is horrified by what is taking place in the South, right? In this book that, while fictional, could take place because it's all based on real stuff. There's a lot of people who are illiterate or just weren't going to sit down and read a book. So to get this book out, because it had gotten so popular, they actually made it into a play, all right? And everybody would come see this play, Uncle Tom's Cabin, if they hadn't read the book. And everybody had experienced this, and it makes the North super anti-slavery. They're already pretty much anti-slavery. This book is really going to turn the North and say, South, stop slavery. This is bad. Interestingly enough, a little random tidbit here. When the Civil War starts, all right, and we're about 20-some years away from the Civil War starting. Abraham Lincoln is the president. We haven't introduced him yet here in the course, but Abraham Lincoln is the president. And he meets Harriet Beecher Stowe for the first time, and he jokingly says, oh, so you're the little lady that started this big war. That's how powerful this book was in stoking concerns for slavery and really awakened a lot of people's mentality to the evils of slavery. So that's what the question here is. It says Abraham Lincoln, when he meets her, he says, you're the little lady that started this big war. Why do you think Uncle Tom's Cabin caused so much controversy in America at the time that Abraham Lincoln will attribute it to one of the causes of the Civil War? Like, what about that book really spoke to people? So pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. So the South, not a big fan of the North's reaction to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And you're like, well, how in the world is the South going to defend slavery? Like, let them try. Well, the South actually has some relatively good talking points in their defense of slavery. Not that slavery's not even, they're not, anyway. The first thing the South is going to say is that Uncle Tom's Cabin is full of lies. It's complete bullcrap. It's not a true story. So, number one, it's not real. Secondly, the North, you guys are hypocrites, all right? Because there's all these immigrants flooding into the North, all right, that are going to work in these factories that are making like a nickel a day, barely enough to survive, if that. The factory work, and this is a true stat, factory workers in the North have a lower standard of living and a shorter life expectancy than slaves in the South. which is a true statement. So they're like, don't talk to us about treating humans well when literally slaves have a higher standard of living. They have 3 meals a day, place to live, and clothes, which is not something that all the factory workers had. And they live longer because you can't replace your slaves. So most rich plantation owners would have like a doctor on call. So if a slave got sick, they would actually have access to a doctor to make sure they can get healthy and get back to work. Whereas if you just died in a factory because you got sick and couldn't see a doctor, they would just hire the next guy on the street for a nickel a day because there were plenty of jobs and tons of immigrants moving to the North because there were jobs. So the North is like, shut your face, or the South is like, shut your face, keep your nose out of our business. And then before you start throwing stones, the Constitution doesn't even say anything about slavery and it being wrong, so we're not actually breaking any laws. And the North is like, yeah, but you know that they were against it. And the South says, really? Because Thomas Jefferson, the man that wrote all men are created equal, George Washington, our hero in this country, both those men owned slaves. How can you sit here and talk about how America really meant to be anti-slavery when the 2 most famous people in American history both owned slaves? Those are pretty good arguments. Legally, not morally, because slavery is still awful. The North will make a rebuttal, and this is a really solid one to show you how bad slavery is. The North says, oh, okay. Factory work sucks, all this other stuff, yeah, okay. However, we have never once seen a factory worker, and all this awful factory work that you talk about, never seen a factory worker escape the evil factory to run down south and be a slave. We have seen slaves run away from slavery to run up north to be a factory worker. Why in the world would a slave want to go be a factory worker if it was worse? The reason that is influential because the true evil of slavery is the fact that you don't own your own life. Factory workers got to at least choose to be a factory worker. Slaves didn't. They don't have a choice. The ownership and lack of your having a life experience is the true evils of chattel slavery. So the question here is, what were some of the arguments the South used to defend themselves against the North's accusations of the evils and the morality of slavery and the South as a whole? So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So there is an anti-slavery movement that starts growing in the North, trying to abolish slavery. Now, I should point out, we've talked about here quite a bit. The main focus of the majority of people that don't like slavery is don't let it expand because it's evil. The idea of going to South Carolina or Mississippi and saying, no more slaves for you guys, that's like an impossibility. Like people couldn't even comprehend that at the time, all right? We know, spoiler alert, all right, that's actually what's going to happen at the end of the Civil War with a thing called the 13th Amendment, which is going to outlaw slavery in the United States. But prior to that, the main concern was don't let it expand. So these people we're going to talk about were actually considered extremists at the time, people that actually wanted to make the South get rid of slavery. These were like, look at those crazy people, like, whoa, too far, man, all right? But looking back on the history, we're like, oh my gosh, the crazy extremist people might have been right. Because there is a movement that seemed extremist at the time called the Abolitionist movement, all right? Which is the movement to end slavery and make it illegal, which is what will eventually happen in America. But when the abolitionist movement comes out, it just seems like crazy talk, all right? There are 2 words that you're going to hear a lot when it deals with slavery and trying to end slavery. They seem like they mean the same thing, and both of them are really good for slaves, but there is a slight difference, all right? The abolitionist movement is the movement to try to make slavery illegal. If you abolish slavery, you make slavery illegal, all right? Emancipation means freeing the slaves. That seems like the same thing, but there's a clear difference here. If you abolish slavery and you make slavery illegal, you have also emancipated the slaves. But if you just go through and free all the slaves, while those slaves might be free, if you haven't abolished the institution legal aspect of slaves, slave owners could just make other people slaves and make it legal again. Or, well, it wouldn't be illegal. Emancipation is just freeing the slaves. Abolish means actually make slavery itself illegal. If you abolish slavery, it also emancipates slaves, but you could technically free all the slaves and slavery still be legal, and then those slave owners just go find other types of people to be slaves. One of the most controversial people at the time is a guy named William Lloyd Garrison. So William Lloyd Garrison, he was against slavery and thought slavery should be completely eradicated. William Lloyd Garrison, he's a white guy. He's the editor of a northern newspaper called The Liberator. All right, he was considered an extremist. He was pretty much in danger most of his life. People in the South hated him. People in the North, there were pro-slavery people that lived in the North. So one of the most controversial things that he did that got people worked up is this dude once burned a copy of the Constitution in public. It's not the actual Constitution, obviously, but a copy of it, because he says he is ashamed to live in a country that allows slavery to exist. He says because the Constitution doesn't clearly say slavery is illegal, it's an immoral document. If you remember a few years ago, people were taking a knee during a national anthem of NFL games and the whole country went ballistic. This is a man setting the Constitution on fire in public to make a statement. Very controversial. But William Lloyd Garrison is one of the first unapologetic abolitionists. Like, no, I'm not just cool with it not spreading. There are people that are slaves in bondage. We have to stop that. So William Lloyd Garrison, the owner of The Liberator, the editor of The Liberator, comes out at the time of this anti-slavery movement and is adamantly against slavery. This is a picture of William Lloyd Garrison on the right. There was so much movement to try to end slavery. Now, spoiler alert, when we end slavery, slaves will end up becoming full citizens, have the right to vote. That, even William Lloyd Garrison didn't know what you do once you free the slaves. Because the idea that slaves would just remain in America seems like crazy talk. Not only would that seem something the slaves don't want to do, how would that work? Because it was still a us and them mentality, even with the anti-slavery people. So there was this idea that, well, since these people were stolen from Africa, we will send them back to Africa. And there's a rich guy named J.I. Asman who actually purchases a massive piece of land in Africa called Liberia, which means liberty. The capital is Monrovia, named after James Monroe, the president. That the whole entire goal was to, if the slaves are free, to have them a place that they can go to. That ends up obviously not working out for a variety of reasons. But there was, people were anti-slavery, and then the people that thought ahead are like, well, how's that going to work out? Like, you end slavery, there's 4 million slaves. What do we do with slaves if we free them? And that, people weren't real sure on how that would work out. So William Lloyd Garrison is one of the most hated men in America, especially in the South. He is very hated in the South at the time. He doesn't live in the South, but his newspaper, The Liberator, makes it down south. Explain why William Lloyd Garrison was hated by so many people. So pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. All right. So Frederick Douglass is crazy famous. Pretty much anybody that we mention in this course is crazy famous. All right. Frederick Douglass's story is a unique one. All right. So Frederick Douglass is born a slave. All right. So Frederick Douglass, let's see what I got here. All right. So Frederick Douglass, as a young man, is taken from his mom like age 8. He bumps around from different plantations. He is apparently an unruly boy, so he wouldn't follow instructions or whatever. He is a kid. And he ends up being purchased by a doctor. I believe the guy's a doctor and his wife in Charleston, South Carolina. All right. So this is kind of rare. If you are a slave and you work on a plantation, it is very rare to get purchased to go work in the house somewhere. because there's kind of a very clear divide among slaves. But the people that buy Frederick Douglass when he is a child, they don't have any slaves, and this is their first slave that they're going to purchase. They've just come into money. A slave is the equivalent of present day probably $80,000 to $90,000. Right? Very, very expensive to purchase. So you had to be very wealthy to purchase a slave. So this husband and wife buy Frederick Douglass. They do not have kids of their own. So Frederick Douglass moves in, and Frederick Douglass in Charleston, South Carolina, he is a slave. The wife, his owner's wife, was a retired school teacher. She saw very quickly that Frederick Douglass is a very, very intelligent young boy. So she starts wanting to teach him. It's her natural instinct. She starts teaching him how to read. They were not aware that it is very illegal to teach a slave how to read. That is literally a law. You could not teach a slave to read. It was designed to keep slaves aggressively ignorant and uneducated so that they couldn't, figure out that they're slaves. Because a lot of slaves had never even really figured out that they were slaves. You were born into it, never allowed to question it. So Frederick Douglass is being taught how to read. His master, the owner, comes in, sees his wife teaching him how to read, and says, "No, you can't do that. It's not a thing that is allowed here. We'll get in trouble." So she's like, "Okay, I won't teach you anymore." Frederick Douglass is so smart that he is able to kind of finish teaching himself how to read. And because they live in this house, this like basically a library, he can read all this stuff. He also started reading The Liberator. William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, and started realizing how awful slavery is and all this other stuff. So when he is 17 years old, he grows up. He's just a rebellious 17-year-old. I imagine his owner comes in one day and says, "Frederick Douglass, take out the trash." Because, I need to point out, Frederick Douglass was treated like their child, not as a slave. He didn't have to go sleep in a little shed out back. He was treated like their child. He lived in the house. He had all the nicest stuff. They treated him very well as far as slaves go, but they treated him like a child. So 17 years old, the owner comes in and says, "Frederick Douglass, go take out the trash." And Frederick Douglass is like, "No!" Just refuses to, being a rebellious 17-year-old. So this had gotten bad enough where he was rebellious enough that they are going to send Frederick Douglass to what is called a slave breaker. A slave breaker's job is to make sure that slaves are no longer rebellious. So I guess the owner, who apparently treated him well, I don't know if he knew how brutal it was. He sent him out here, and he's sent out here to this like cabin in the middle of nowhere. And every morning, the slave breaker comes out to Frederick Douglass. The slave breaker is a white guy. And says, "Frederick Douglass, I want you to dig a hole," just to try to force him to do something. Frederick Douglass is like, "No, I'm not going to do it." So the slave breaker beats him up and says, "We'll try it again tomorrow." So the next day, the slave breaker comes out to Frederick Douglass and says, "Frederick Douglass, dig a hole." And Frederick Douglass is like, "I ain't going to do it." The guy beats him up again. He says, "We'll try it again tomorrow." Day 3 comes out, and he says, "Frederick Douglass, dig a hole." And Frederick Douglass says, "I'm not going to dig a hole, and you're not going to hit me again." And the guy goes to hit him, and Frederick Douglass beats the man to death. Now, that is clearly the story I heard for most of my education, and then here recently, it is just he beat the guy up, he doesn't kill him, which seems like an odd change in history. Regardless, because if he killed him, he'd be like, "Oh, time to dig the hole now." But regardless if he beats him up or he kills him, the consequences are pretty much going to be the same for Frederick Douglass. Not good. You can't be a slave and beating up white people, especially when you're already on probation because you're here at a slave breaker. So Frederick Douglass, and here's where the story gets crazy. Frederick Douglass escapes to the north. That's not the crazy part. He escapes to the north dressed in a Navy uniform on a military ship. Now, the reason that's odd is because, number one, only white people are allowed on the Navy ships. How did he pretend to be in the Navy? All right. And Frederick Douglass, this is a picture of Frederick Douglass. This is not a slave that could pass as being white. He's also enormous. He's like 6'4", like 230 pounds. He is an enormous human being. Most people in Navy ships are really small because they have to be crammed in there. on the Navy ship. So how he was able to make his way north pretending to be in the Navy on a Navy ship, I don't know. He gets to the north, and he actually meets William Lloyd Garrison, because he'd read the Liberator, the guy we had talked about. William Lloyd Garrison wants him to write a book. Well, that's what Frederick Douglass has. He has the ability to write. So Frederick Douglass does. He writes a book about his life experiences, literally called The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. Escaped slaves don't have the ability to write because they're not allowed to be educated. Frederick Douglass does. Frederick Douglass writes this book, and he clearly, 100%, it is a primary source because this dude was there. He talks about the evils of slavery, and he says, hey, I was actually treated great by my owners, and it was still evil. That was the important part. He says, was I getting whipped all the time and all this stuff? No, not once I moved in with my owners from the time I was 8 to 17, no. But it was still evil. They gave me everything I needed. I had more stuff than most of the kids on the street, but it was still evil because I didn't exist. I had no say-so in my own life ever, and that is the true evils of slavery. He is so honest in his book, he actually names his owners. And this book becomes a bestseller. This is very dangerous for Frederick Douglass because Frederick Douglass can be captured and taken back down south because he is now famous and he is an escaped slave. Frederick Douglass, to prevent being recaptured, actually flees to England. And it continues to be famous in England, makes trips back throughout the Civil War, giving speeches and stuff, but it was very dangerous for him to do so. But when he was in England, to avoid being recaptured and forced to be a slave again, his fans actually got together and bought Frederick Douglass's freedom from his owners so that Frederick Douglass could come back to America without being thought to be forced back into slavery. And so he refused. He was rich enough, he could have bought his own freedom, but he said that I should never be a requirement that somebody has to buy their own freedom. So he refused to buy his own freedom, but his fans did put money together and actually bought his freedom for him from his owners. So the question here is, how is Frederick Douglass's personal experience able to help many more people understand the evils of slavery more so than the thousands of other slaves that had escaped before him? So talk about basically what skill set he had that other people didn't, and explain that. Pause me, and we're moving on. All right. If you've been through the school system in public schools in North Carolina or anywhere in America, you have probably heard of the Underground Railroad. They talk about it so much. Let me clarify one very specific thing. There is no train involved in the Underground Railroad. Basically, by the mid-1800s, people started figuring out that if you make it to the north, slaves, if you make it to the north, then you're free. Still racist, still probably not going to give you a job because you're black, but you would be free, and then you could travel to Canada, and that's where a lot of slaves ended up. The Underground Railroad becomes famous because the owners are terrified of it, and they talk about it all the time. When slaves figured out how they could make it to the north, they would just leave in the middle of the night, all right, and through a series of people that might help them, this or that, whatever their path is, depending on where they are in the country, and they would just disappear. Slaves are extremely expensive. The owners, when they would wake up and some of their slaves are just gone, never to be seen from again, terrified them. So the owners actually coined the term Underground Railroad because they're like, I don't know where they went. It's like they just got on Underground Railroad and just disappeared. All right, there's no actual subway system. It was just a series of trails through the woods, depending on where you were in the country, of how you would get north. This is kind of a map. The gray areas are places that had slavery, and there's different routes you can get to the north. You could use the swamps on the east coast, but there's dangerous out there with a lot of like poisonous snakes and stuff. You could try to stow away on a ship on the Mississippi River, but by doing that, it was very easy to get caught because if there's missing slaves, they check every boat. The Appalachian Mountains are probably the most effective, which run from the south to the north, because if a slave escapes, slave catchers go out to try to catch them, and they're on horse. If you get in the mountains, it kind of forces everybody to be on foot, and the slaves running for their life usually outrun the guy that's going to get $50 for capturing them. So the highest success rate was across the Appalachian Mountains. The Underground Railroad is very famous because the owners talked about it. Thousands of people escaped. Thousands, not millions, Not hundreds of thousands, just thousands. It really wasn't enough to make a dent, but it is significant enough to acknowledge that this was a thing that was happening in society at the time. And it could happen, and the South was terrified about it, and they put a lot of their slaves on lockdown, afraid their slaves would run away. The most famous, and y'all probably have heard about this woman, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman found a way to escape slavery. When she got to freedom, she realized, I can't just leave my family there in bondage. And she made a bunch of trips back with a pistol, right? And would get family members that were willing to leave and bring them to freedom. She carried a pistol on her, not to shoot white people, even though she 100% would have if she needed to. It was if you got halfway back and one of the slaves was like, I need to go back, I'm afraid. She would rather shoot the slave than let them go back so they don't tell them their path on how they're getting to freedom. Harriet Tubman is super famous. The South was terrified of her at the time, thought she was going to come steal all their slaves. One thing that really happened that was negative for Harriet Tubman, she's fantastic. She was actually a spy in the Civil War. There's all types of more stuff on Harriet Tubman. Her biographer, the person who wrote her biography, drastically exaggerated how many people she brought to freedom. They said it was like 10,000 people that she got to freedom. It was around 80. Which is crazy amount of 80 human beings that she brought in. But because her biographer exaggerated it, trying to make her look better. And this was against Harriet Tubman's wishes. I think this was done after Harriet Tubman had passed away, or at least when she was an older age. That once people realized that was fake and that she didn't actually save that many people, it made people start questioning all aspects of Harriet Tubman's life, which is very unfortunate because Harriet Tubman is an absolutely fantastic person. But that is why it's so dangerous to try to exaggerate. Even if you think you're helping somebody, don't exaggerate about good stuff they did because then it makes people question everything. But the question here is explain why Harriet Tubman is famous and how her biographer actually hurt her image by exaggerating her feats. All right, that's what I got for you guys today. See you guys tomorrow.